Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. I wanted to show you something, an ancient passage from Jewish law that I think will really enrich your relationship with God and help you to come closer to Him. It's like there's this discussion, it's a technical discussion about a legal question. And then along the way though, there's this principle that's mentioned. It's like an underlying principle, and it's really at the heart of Jewish spirituality. And so this is from a tractate in the Mishnah called Rosh Hashanah. So it's all about the new year on the Hebrew calendar. And you may remember, way back in the Torah, God said in Leviticus chapter 23, "These are my appointed times." And then he listed the feasts of the Lord. And every one of these feasts points to Messiah in very prophetic and profound ways. And there are certain things that needed to be done for this to happen. Like for instance, the leaders of Israel, they needed to know when the new month started so that they could say when the festivals were to happen. And so really this tractate is all about how they calculated those things. It tells some interesting stories along the way about even some tensions that were had when, let's say that a couple of the leaders of the community had a different opinion on when the new month should start. Well, then what do you do? Do some people do Yom Kippur on one day and some people on another day? Interestingly enough, that is a question sometimes for people who are just they're coming back to the Torah, so to speak, and they're wanting to learn about how they can keep God's commandments. So if that's you may be interested in reading this tractate of Rosh Hashanah and learning a little bit more about how those matters were addressed 2,000 years ago, because really history does repeat itself. So this is an interesting question. God says that on Yom Teruah, on the Day of Trumpets, you're to listen to the sound of the shofar. So let's say that let's say this is a little bit funny too. I think we can laugh a little bit. Let's say there's somebody down in a well, or he's in an underground storeroom, or he's like in a barrel, and he blows the shofar, and then you hear the sound of the shofar. Does that count? Does that count? Have you fulfilled your obligation, so to speak, to hear the sound of the shofar? Or what if it's really unclear and you more just hear the echo? Does that count? All right, so that's the question that's being discussed here. And the reason that this was discussed is because this actually happened. This something you'll discover is that much of the Mishnah, it was case law. It's all of these historic examples of legal questions that came up in the nation of Israel as they tried to keep God's law as best they could. And so maybe it's kind of bizarre, right? But when you have millions and millions of people doing these commandments year after year, you have all kinds of really interesting cases that come up. And so these are some examples. And this is one that would probably happen more often. Let's say that your house was right next to the synagogue and was actually attached to the synagogue, and you just heard them blowing the shofar in the synagogue on the Day of Trumpets. Does that count? Or do you actually have to be there, in the middle of the prayer service to hear it? And, maybe you're like, well, what kind of a lazy person would ask that question? Well, what if you're a paralytic and you're stuck at home and you can't make it to the synagogue next door? There's some very legitimate questions here. So if you're interested in history, if you're interested in how the Jewish community historically has kept the Torah and interpreted it, you're really going to love the Mishnah. It wasn't written down until the mid 100s, like roughly 120 years after Yeshua walked the hills of Galilee, but much of it came from an earlier time, and it was all memorized and communicated orally. So anyways, you may find it interesting. This is what it boiled down to. They said in all these cases, here's the big deal. Let's say that you heard the sound of the shofar. Did you hear or did you listen? And it's the same word in Hebrew. It's Shema. Interestingly enough, Yeshua said that's the greatest commandment. In the Gospel of Mark, the question was posed to him, what's the greatest commandment? And he quoted the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. He said, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God. Now, Matthew and Luke only quote the second half of the quote. They just have Yeshua saying, you shall love the Lord your God. And yeah, he did say that. But we learn in the Gospel of Mark, he actually quoted the full enchilada, so to speak, the whole passage. And the reason that's interesting is because there are actually two verbs in the greatest commandment. The second is to love, the first is to listen. What does that teach us? You cannot truly love someone if you don't first listen to them. That applies to relationship with God, that applies to relationship with people also. And if you don't believe me, try not listening to your spouse sometime and then see if they really feel like you love them. If your spouse says, "You're not listening to me," that probably says, "I don't feel like you're acting in a loving way towards me right now." All right. So anyways, that's something of an aside. But really this Mishnah that we're looking at right now, it does apply. You know, are you just hearing? Are you overhearing the sound of the shofar, or are you listening to the sound of the shofar? If you're listening, then it counts. If you just happen to hear it in passing, then it doesn't count. And it's really interesting here. There's a difference between the legal term that's used for, let's see, how is it translated? Fulfilling your obligation, doing your duty, performing your duty, carrying out your obligation. This word is used 4 times, and in the translation, every single time it's phrased slightly differently, but in Hebrew it's just a single word. It's the word yatzah, and that means to go out, to emerge. It's like the word for the Exodus. So basically, in Jewish law, when you've done something that God said to do, then you've made your Exodus. You've gone out, so to speak. Gone out from what? Gone out to what? Well, I'll just leave that question for you to think about. But there's some very deep things right there. And so anyways, basically this is what they say. So, you know, if he concentrated his mind on it, if he directed his mind, and I want to show you the Hebrew for that. It's kivein libo. So this word here, kivein, it has the sense of concentrating or directing, and then libo, that's his lev. What's your lev? Your lev is your heart. It's actually the short form of the word. Sometimes the longer form, levav, is used, which I find really interesting because that's kind of the sound that the heart makes. We would say lub-dub in English, but, in Hebrew you'd say levav, levav. And if you actually listen to someone's heart, it kind of says that, which is really beautiful, actually, because we have our English word love, to love someone. And my first daughter, Tirza, when she was just, a couple years old too, I'd hold her with her head against my chest, and I would tell her that my heart was saying love. And one time I was holding her and she listened to my heart and she said, "Your heart is saying love." And it was really special because really that is what God created our hearts to say. And so anyways, it's kind of neat that the Hebrew word for heart is lev or levav, and then we have our English word love. I'm not saying that they're like literally related in terms of the etymological origins of our English word love, but maybe that'll help you to remember the Hebrew word for heart. So love in English, lev in Hebrew. So basically that's what they say it boils down to. What it boils down to is where's your heart at? What are you thinking about? And so that's the principle. And I thought maybe we could just chat about that for another minute. If you're familiar with Judaism and how it's practiced, you don't just do a mitzvah. You don't just do a commandment. Before you do the commandment, you say a blessing. You say a bracha, and there's a specific formula that's used. You say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to," or who has commanded us regarding, and then you say what the mitzvah is. Kind of fill in the blank there. So before we nail up the mezuzah on the doorpost, we say we praise God for making us holy through his commandments, for bringing his sanctity into our lives through these things that he's told us to do. And this Hebrew word for holiness and sanctity also has the sense of specialness, and it really is special. If you buy a new house and you nail the mezuzah up on the doorpost that has those little tiny scrolls from the Torah, it's a very special thing to do. It's kind of like a dedication of the house. And this applies to so many of the commandments. Shabbat, the Sabbath, it's a very special time with God, with family, with congregation, and the list goes on and on. And so that's why we say a bracha, a blessing, before we do a mitzvah, a commandment. because we don't just want to do these things in a mindless fashion. We don't just want to, like just rattle through it all because this is what we do. No, we want to stop and we want to give God our full attention, and we want to say, we recognize right now that we're doing this because of you. We're doing this. This is a special moment between you and us. And when we do that, we're concentrating our minds. We're directing our heart to our Father in heaven. And that, according to the sages, is when you've really, fulfilled your obligation or performed your duty, or, literally that's when you've made your exodus, you've gone out. Hopefully that gets you thinking, because there's a lot there. There's some very rich insights there, and I'm not even going to try to unpack them all. But I wanted to share that with you. So, regardless of whether you practice Judaism or not, regardless of whether you try to, keep all of these commandments, what would that principle look like in your relationship with God? When you're about to do something that you're doing because of God, that you're doing because of Yeshua's influence in your life, what if you just stopped and paused for a moment and took a deep breath and turned your heart to God and just gave him all of you, the focus of your mind, and said your own little blessing. Maybe you could say, praise you for telling us to do this, or thank you for your word in which you have said this, or you know what if you even just said, I love you? Because really, that's the heart of God's commandments. All the way back in the book of Exodus, he said that he keeps his chesed, his kindness, with those who love him and keep his commandments. It's like these two things that are connected in God's mind: being his lover and doing what he said. Interestingly enough, God sends his Messiah. Messiah talks the same way. The Son speaks like the Father. If you love me, keep my commandments. So if you've ever read the book, the 5 love languages, you could almost say that mitzvot, commandments, those are one of God's love languages. So if you think that you can tell God you love him, but you don't do what he said, like in your actual lifestyle, God's like, actually, no, that doesn't mean anything to me. If you love me, keep my commandments. And so that's why I'm saying, what would it look like for you to take this principle from Jewish spirituality and really incorporate it into your relationship with God? Before you do something that God said, just say, God, in this moment, I love you. And I'm doing this because I'm expressing my love to you. And I love you because you first loved me. Thank you for expressing who you are and your love to me in your word. And by giving me good instructions, that are good for me, that are healthy for me. I'm just kind of giving you an example of maybe what it would look like, not just to keep the letter of the law, but to also keep the spirit of the law. And that's the big idea in Judaism. That's why before I put on my tefillin, my phylacteries, I say a blessing. I bless God for giving me this commandment, for giving me this special moment with him, this opportunity to spend quality time with him. I will share one more thing with you in brief, because it's very much related. The Hebrew word for commandment is mitzvah, as I mentioned. It's related to the Hebrew word for neck. What's the connection? Well, that actually is the connection. That's what your neck does. Your neck connects your head and your body, just like commandments do what? They're an opportunity to connect with God. They're a chance to spend that time with him, and to renew that relationship with him. So hopefully that, sometimes depending on how you grew up, some people talk about God's law in really bad ways. They confuse the law of God and legalism. And guess what? Like, God's law is all about love. That's a good thing. Sometimes, unfortunately, because we're really messed up inside without the Spirit, we take God's law and we turn it into this ugly legalism thing. That's not good. But so just recognize that God's law and God's commandments are good. Legalism is bad. Doing God's commandments in the context of a love relationship with him is a beautiful thing, and it's very life-giving. It will breathe new life into you. But if you just do it, without really thinking about what you're doing in a mindless way, without taking that moment to look to him, that doesn't count for nearly as much, does it? It's just it doesn't matter in the same way. So anyways, this is an example of how studying the Mishnah, studying some of the ancient Jewish texts can really enrich your spiritual life and can make your discipleship to Yeshua more meaningful, because this was his world. These are some of the laws and the discussions that were happening in the Jewish world of Jesus and his disciples, and that's what that's what I'm all about personally as a teacher. That's what our school, Holy Language Institute, is about, following Yeshua of Nazareth in a Hebrew way, coming to know him more closely through studying the original Jewish context of the Bible, including the New Testament. You know, it's not all just Hebrew language study, it's studying that original Jewish context of the Bible also. And this is actually just one thing that I talked about from our most recent lesson. We're doing this lesson series called Mishnah Snapshots, doing just what I did just now. I gave you a snapshot from the Mishnah, and then I showed you the deeper spiritual principles, and talked about how that could apply to discipleship, to the Messiah. And this was actually like a little takeaway from lesson 48. So this is a big course that we're doing in Mishnah Snapshots. I'd love to have you learning with us. Our website's holylanguage.com. And if you want the full lesson, it's lesson 48 in the Mishnah Snapshots series. In the full lesson, we talked about some disagreements between the sages and how they worked that out over calendar stuff. Like I said, history repeats itself. It's not like something that just started happening today. We looked at a really interesting example of how some words in the Torah, they can be read in two different ways depending on how they're vowel pointed. And it's not always either or, it can also be both and. We learned about how a court was constituted 2,000 years ago in Israel, and how that had its roots going all the way back to Moses and the original Sanhedrin, the 70 elders. We looked at a beautiful picture of the relationship between a rabbi and a disciple, and it was very heartwarming just to imagine that being an example of our relationship with Rabbi Jesus, Rabbi Yeshua. We looked at the question of, there are a couple of really puzzling stories in the Torah. Remember when Moses had his hands up, and as long as his hands were up, Israel was winning, his hands went down and they started losing? There's that. Well, it's the hands. It was like magical hands? What's going on there? There's also, the story of the bronze serpent on the pole. Well, what's the story there? Like magical shiny snake? So that's discussed in the Mishnah. And actually God is referred to as Israel's father in heaven. Sometimes if you grew up in Christianity, you think, we have this idea of God as Father, and then Jews have this idea of, God as distant God. Well, it's not actually the case. So we talked a little bit about that. We also talked about the Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year prayer service today, and how much of it goes back to the time of Jesus and his disciples. Yeshua and his guys went to synagogue for Yom Teruah, for the Day of Trumpets, and they prayed all the traditional Jewish prayers along with the Jewish people. And so the prayer service today, how many of those prayers were prayed by Jesus? How much of what they do today dates back to 2,000 years ago? So we looked at a couple Mishnahs that actually answer that question, and they're very historically valuable. If your big question in life is what would Jesus do, if you really want to follow the Messiah, then it's helpful to know what Jesus actually did, and it's helpful to know how much of what's done by the Jewish community today was done by Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, 2,000 years ago. It was a really cute reference in the Mishnah to children practicing shofar blowing. And then we also saw a really interesting example of an apostle in the synagogue. Apostles weren't just something that Jesus made up. There were apostles 2,000 years ago in the Jewish community. And when we actually look at what apostles were and what they did 2,000 years ago in Judaism, it definitely helps us to understand Yeshua's apostles better. And it also helps us to understand the apostle today. The calling of the apostle, the training of the apostle, and then apostolic ministry in general. So I'd love to have you studying with me, discussing some of those topics in greater detail. Come see us at holylanguage.com. Jump in on lesson 48 in our Mishnah Snapshot series. And I really hope that this discussion has made you smile. I hope that it's warmed your heart just to think about commandments being one of God's love languages, to think about the principle of saying a bracha before doing a mitzvah, and just doing the things that the Father said with all your heart and with all your mind, as chances to have those special moments with Him, as opportunities to connect with Him, and also with His people. So thanks for joining me in this conversation.